Okay, this is our next project, and we're going to be cutting the floor out, and we're just assessing how we will approach this one. And the project has the floor is pretty messed up, so we're going to have them do a shot blast for us first. We have some areas on the floor that have incredible cracks and things going on. We have a piece of wood across this opening that we're going to have to pull out and fill that in. So we'll probably over those areas be using an anti-fracture membrane underneath us. And then we'll put reinforcing fiberglass cloth with that to help keep any cracks from coming back. Our approach is going to be to shot blast it, do a base coat, and then let the contractors come in and install all their cabinets just in case something goes wrong and they have to move something, we can fix it up. And then we'll do our finish coat at the very end after everything, all the major work is done. Okay, we've had the floor, we've had a professional floor prep company come in and do what's called shot blast on the floor. And they've hand ground areas that were really bad. And what it does when you shot blast it, it exposes how much it is really cracked. And so we decided that the way we're going to approach this floor, I was going to just do isolated RedGard anti-fracture membrane over some spots, but because of how many cracks there are in this, we're going to put a thin coat of Milestone to flatten the whole floor out. And then when that dries, we'll come over with a RedGard, use it as an anti-fracture membrane using our 4-ounce fiberglass cloth in conjunction with that. So today what we're going to do is finish the prep, get it all clean, vacuum out all the cracks, and do one thin coat of 1 part 70 grit sand to 1 part 30 grit sand. We're going to use a recycled glass sand. And then we will be using to every 1 part of sand, we'll be using about 1.5 parts of cement. And we'll be using our Acrylic E, and that will be our mix. And that'll be how we coat this whole floor out. We have a few really deep spots that we're going to pre-coat, and we'll show you those in a second. Okay, we have some really big cracks like I mentioned, and so we're going to pre-fill those. And we've got our mix. You'll notice our mix is loose enough that it can flow down in and wet the surface it's trying to bond to. And I'm going to actually make sure that it gets down in there good. And when these set up a little bit, we will be able to go over this with a coat over the entire room. So we're just going to fill these in. Okay, we're getting ready to do the Milestone base coat over this whole floor, and we're going to be filling, just letting it fill the cracks as we go. It's the same mix that we used in the cracks, and we've mixed 12 quarts of sand, and we've mixed 8 quarts of cement. You can see how that pretty much is just about a 5-gallon bucket of mix. And I'm going to be using just a regular concrete trowel for this. You can use any length you want. I happen to have a 12-inch trowel here that I use. Keep the mix wet enough so that it bonds and wets the surface good you're going over. And the reason that I like the concrete trowel is because the concrete trowel does a good job of doing a nice flat, stiff steel to level things with. And this will give us a good surface to go over with our next step. And we can leave some of these draw marks in here right now if I want, because I will be able to sand those out and fix up a little bit. So I don't have to be too perfectionist. And I am trying to level the floor out a little bit. When I find a low spot, I'll put a coat over it. Sometimes I'll even reach back and put just a touch more over it to level it a little bit more. You can see how nice this is flowing for me. If my mix starts to stiffen, I will stop for a minute, add a little more acrylic to it than Milestone E, and I'll thin it want to keep this consistency that trails out real good for me and is wet enough to flow over the surface. I don't need to be any deeper than just enough to cover the surface with my sand aggregates unless I'm doing a fill. So I can actually put a fair bit of pressure and just let it barely cover the surface as I go. You can see my mix is starting to stiffen a little bit here. And I will have it thin to do in a minute because I want it to be able to flow good over the surface. I will try to keep a wet edge as I go across the roof. I don't want to get real dry spots just because then it's a little harder to sand those in. I'm about to put on my respirator because when you get a big area, we don't have great ventilation in this place. We're in the Olympic Hotel, and this is a good reason for doing this kind of a surface on a floor is there is no way to take this kind of a concrete slab out and redo it. And so this is a great place to use Milestone. And now I'm going to go ahead and put my respirator on. Okay, what we've done is we've got this floor all coated out with our Milestone sand coat, and you can see how nicely the whole floor looks. It looks incredibly different than it did yesterday. It took us about 3 or 4 hours to actually coat this floor out for 3 of us working on it. And now what we want to do is we want to put a coat of RedGard over it so that none of these cracks that we filled telegraph through to the surface. Now I'm using a special fiberglass cloth that they use in some of the AFIS systems and the stucco systems. And it's made to be in a cement alkaline environment. You want to make sure you use the right kind of fiberglass cloth. I have it both in 4-inch and 4-foot rolls. We have about 1,200 square feet that we're doing here. So we want to make sure we're using the 4-foot rolls for that. If you just had seams, you could do just the seams with this, but we had, this whole floor had cracks everywhere in it, so we just elected to go with the whole entire floor instead of trying to spot and do some seams. And the way we'll do this is we'll roll this cloth out, and then we will force the RedGard through it. We'll try to move the cloth just a little as we do it, and I think we'll trowel it through it. And right now I'm going to stretch out some. We're not going to overlap the edges of our cloth just so it doesn't thicken on the edge. And we'll just stretch it out over the entire floor, and then we'll start at the center of each sheet and work to the edges so we don't get bubbles. And you could start at one end and work to the edge. Okay, now we're going to work from the center to the ends because we have a really long run. You could work from the end to the other end. You don't want to work from the ends to the middle because this fiberglass cloth is fairly elastic and that it different directions and it'll stretch out on you. And you'll get bubbles and then you'll have to dart them out if you do that. So we're going to start right here in the middle of this piece and I'll work to both ends. I'm just going to put a little bit down. I'm going to drill it right through the cloth. I'll make sure I get good penetration. If you want to, you can put a smaller areas, you can put a coat of this down first and then bed your cloth into it. We're not going to do that in this instance. We just want to get it just enough, just kind of thin over the mesh, just enough to fill in the mesh as we go on this coat. And I'll be rolling the whole entire floor out, doing it all at once, from one row to the next. Okay, we've got our first layer of mesh bedded down with RedGard. And now what I'd like to do before I do the milestone over, this is dried incidentally overnight. And now we're going to take and add, we've added just a little bit of sand to RedGard. We've added approximately to a gallon, we've added about 3 quarts of sand. We added just a tiny bit of water to thin it a bit. And now we're went around and cut the edges in with a brush. We're just rolling this on real thin. And what this will do for us is it'll give us a little bit of a mechanical tooth with that sand aggregate the surface. And it'll just allow the milestone to have that much better of a bond because it roughens the surface with this 70 grit sand that we've added. Okay, we're spreading a coat of 1 part 70 grit sand, 1 part 30 grit sand, 1 gray cement, 1 white cement. We've colored our acrylic so that the Milestone E, so that it'll be approximately the color of our base coat when we do our finish. This would be probably referred to as a second scratch coat because it's going over the RedGard, and we're trying to just fill in the mesh, make sure there's no pattern from the mesh slab. We do have an opportunity as we do this pass to level the floor just a little bit more. Each pass we can level it a little more. I'm still using a real stiff concrete trowel. This one has a rounded edge which tends to leave a little less of a line behind me. We'll come back and sand that inline in a minute. And I've got my mix, so you want the mix fairly thin, you don't want it too stiff. This is actually almost on the edge of being too stiff. And you want to really work it so it penetrates in good as we're doing it. And then we can come back over and smooth it out one way. Pressure on the heel of my trowel so the nose rises up a little bit, and I'll sand that and run that through. And I'm using quite a bit of pressure on the final strokes to flatten it out good. Real low angle so it lays that more nice. And if I have a dip in the floor, I'll make sure I try to trowel in such a way that I go across it to fill it. Okay, we have a 1 step in or just a little small set of stairs. And I'm going to work out with a tool that's called the hawk, and I'll just pick the mud off just a little bit at a time on my trowel. I don't have to try to pick up all kinds at once. I'll use the hawk just to help me control the amount I put on my trowel. And we'll be standing in the 2 after we're done before it dries. I just kind of try to draw all my corners nice and sharp here. And we'll go through the top. Using Okay, we've got the whole floor coated, but we've been dropping back and sanding it as it begins to dry a little bit. And the best way to know when to sand it is if you start seeing dry spots like we have here. You want it to still be wet, but if you see a little dry spot, then you know the high spots are still going to be a little wet, the low spots are probably starting to dry out. Where it's thinner, it's going to dry faster. And if you can sand it while it's still wet, there's not that much dust because it's got a lot of moisture in it, it's pretty heavy. But still, we recommend to wear a respirator. And we use 80 grit sandpaper usually. The sand in the surface itself actually ends up kind of being half what does it. We're not over sanding this. All we're trying to do on this point on this coat is just knock down ridges from the trowel. We use a putty knife to kind of scrape the edges a little bit, make sure we don't scoop up at the edges, make base hard to put in, and just trying to keep it flat. We're not trying to make it perfect. Then it really you just work the high spots a little extra and just kind of roll along. If you get it and it starts getting wet, you have to wait. You shouldn't, depending on temperature, you shouldn't have to wait much more than a half hour, maybe an hour after you put it down. If you put it thicker, it'll take longer. So we put this pretty thin, just the aggregates. And I want to point out that it's a good idea to wear a respirator whenever you're sanding. We definitely wear respirators when we're putting this down in an enclosed area like this. Obviously, I don't wear it when I'm trying to talk to the camera, but we do wear it when we're spreading it. Okay, we just let the surfaces of the stairs kind of build themselves. We didn't use a straight edge because they were real straight. And I went ahead and sort of built the corner square, and then I'm using my sanding pad. This has still got the 80 grit paper on it, and I'm raising the corners in, just kind of eyeing them in to get them just right. This is a base coat, so we have let these corners. You can see how dry the actual tread of the stair is. We let the corners set up a lot longer because we've got it on there quite a bit thicker. And we just kind of sand this surface first, then this surface, and then we lightly ease it in. You just work your way slowly back and forth. And take your time and they'll come out really nice for you. And that's usually how we do an easy edge. Okay, we've got our little mixing station set up here. We normally on a job will set up a station where we can mix, and if it spills, we have tarps under us and stuff. And the very first thing that we would do, and we batched our colorant out at our job, or back at the shop, to bring out to the job, and this is enough for 5 gallons of the mix that we're going to be doing. And so we brought an unopened 5-gallon container of the Milestone Type E. That's the acrylic liquid part of our mix. And we'll be adding all this pigment into this. And the best way to do it, if you're trying to make sure you get all the pigment in so you get consistent color, is to pour a little of the acrylic off and then use that to wash the pigments out of your quart container. And a brush works really good for pulling it off the sides. Then use a little more, wash and rinse it again until you get all the pigment out and into your 5-gallon pail of E. We've already sort of pre-done that so that we don't have to make you watch us do that. And then our mix on this one, because of the color we're trying to do, is going to be a blend of 1 part white Milestone powder. This is our hybridized Portland cement, and 1 part of the gray cement. And for this first application, we're going to actually put some 70 grit sand in. We normally would use a Trivitro's number 70 recycled glass sand. and it's a very, very fine sand. It's almost like a powder. But it'll give us enough tooth on the floor to flatten it out good and get us started. And so our particular mix is about 6 quarts of number 70 sand and 3 quarts of each, the white and the gray. And I'll kind of show you a little bit about the consistency of the mix as you watch it sort of drip off of the paddle here. But you want it fairly loose and fairly wet because you want it to be wet enough to wet the surface you're going over. And that when you've got sand in your mix, especially the sheetrock style paddle that we're using here is a really good paddle to use. Anyway, so we've got a mix, a good enough mix to get us started here. We'll kind of give it one more spin before we get going, and then we'll have at it. I just wanted to take a minute to mention about samples. We do samples for every job. We work with designers and homeowners to get them what they want and get it approved. That defines the color out for us when we go to do the job. In all of our samples, we usually put a record on the back as to what we did to get that sample, the colors, the type of trelling we did, the mix that it was. And that's real important. It's really important to do samples to prove out how you will do your actual trelling and the textures and the color movement. So I just wanted to take a minute to mention that before we get going. Okay, I want to give you a little bit of a shot of the viscosity of this mix. It's really pretty thin. I like the mix to be wet enough so I know it's saturating the surface I'm trying to bond to. And the idea of this mix is that we just put this on about as thin as the mix will allow us. It's got that 70% in there, which kind of dictates how thick it's going to go on, because it's going to go on at least as thick as the 70 grit sand. And I'm using a fair bit of pressure, not a lot of angle. If you sort of watch, I have my trough pretty flat. And I'm just kind of trying to work back and forth across this edge. And I like trying to keep the edge sort of natural. We do have another coat that goes over the top of this, the final finish. This will peek through a little bit here and there on the way this one is set up, but not very much, maybe just like 5% showing of this coat. But this will give us a nice, even, smooth texture to work our next application over the top. So you can just see how I keep it nice and flat, and just kind of working this edge back and forth. Okay, well, I wanted to just mention, as we did this whole floor, we kept kind of the leading edge of what we're doing wet and just kept going back and forth across it. And we did thin our mix regularly to keep it nice and thin so it would bond good as we went. And now what we're doing is we're kind of, as it sets up a little bit and you start to see some dry spots, you can come back out on it and actually walk on it. You'll see that I'm not leaving any kind of footprints, but I'm also not wearing shoes with treads on it, and I'm being really careful with my knee pads so that I don't leave marks. You can even kind of have a little kneeling board if you want. And all that we're doing is just really lightly, we have 80 grit sandpaper on just regular pad sander like used with sheetrock. We're just really lightly sanding it, trying to get any of the little lumps off of the surface that kind of fall off to the side. It's about this much sanding. If you see anything you need to focus on, you focus on it. But I really will put down. If I were to kneel down with these knee pads, it still may be soft enough to make a little mark, so be real careful about that. And then the other thing you want to make sure you do is you want to pull your tape as you go through, because if this tape gets buried a little bit, it's really hard to get out, and it takes a long time. And right now you can just practically pull it at will, but sand first under where you're going to pull it. And you just kind of go over the whole surface real gently. If you waited till tomorrow when it was totally dry, it would be so hard, it would take a a long time to do, it would never come out nearly as good. It's best always to stay a little extra, let it dry a bit, and then get back on it and sand it. It's usually a half hour to an hour after you put it down, sometimes a little more depending on temperature. Okay, I wanted to talk just a little bit about where this floor is at and how we've approached this, and I should have did this even before we did this last coat. But we basically, before we put this coat on, we were at the point where I would expect a nice concrete floor to start. And the steps preceding this last one don't need to happen if you have a nice concrete floor. You can start right in with this coat that we just put down, which is a sanded base coat. We made this one the right color of our finish, and we're going to let it show through a little bit on our finish. So it was important it be the right color. It doesn't always matter that much, but it did in this case. And now our next coat, this is what I would expect almost all concrete floors to start off with, this coat that we just did. Now our next coat would be the finish coat. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's how we're going to do it this time, and that's how it normally is. Anyway, so we're going to go ahead and show you how to mix the finish coat, and then we'll get ready and start plastering. Okay, I wanted to talk about how we start when we're mixing. And we have our acrylic that's colored, our Milestone Type E acrylic. And this has quite a bit of pigment in it, and we, to start the day, opened it up and using the gloves, reached down to the bottom and made sure we stirred all the pigment in good. Some of the pigments are heavy enough that they don't stir in well, even with the stir stick. So you really got to pour the liquid off and look down there and make physically sure that you've got it all mixed in really good. And then as you go throughout the day, every time you go to use it, make sure your lid's on good. You want to make sure you shake it and agitate that pigment back in so it stays in suspension throughout the day. Otherwise, you'll have a concentrated mix by the time you get to the bottom, and you'll have pigments that are settled and just kind of sitting there. And our mix today, and I'm going to add a little bit of the acrylic colored E to that. Our mix today has been 1 part white Milestone powder, and then 1 part of the gray Milestone powder, and then enough of the acrylic E to make it the right viscosity for us to work with. I like to mix my mix a little bit in advance, let it take up a little bit and re-temper it so that it stays the right viscosity for me to work with throughout the day. And I'm going to go ahead and re-stir this now. We mixed this a little while ago. It's gotten pretty thick. So we're going to go ahead and re-stir it, and then we'll go and actually start. Okay, we're applying the finish coat. We're keeping our mix fairly thin, and we're actually working from hawks so that we can control the way we apply it as opposed to just pouring it out of the bucket and trying to do it that way. This way we can work with really small amounts at a time and apply it in a really controlled fashion. I am trying to sort of work a wet edge. It's not absolutely necessary if you're alone and you're doing a wide floor. As long as you just kind of blend it in as you go back and forth across, it should look fine. But there are 3 of us here, and rather than 3 of us each work an area, we work the wet edge and we kind of leapfrog back and forth across so that no one person's technique will dominate it. It tends to always look good if the same person has the same technique everywhere. You have a good mixed blend of techniques. It'll look better than having one person control an area. And we're just kind of putting it on real thin and very controlled. That's the texture that we're going for. I like to try to keep the backside of my trowel pretty clean too as I go. We're trying to keep the whole area clean so if we get a little lumps, we're trying to make sure that we get those out of the mix. They to maybe reach into a little bit. It's not a trowel and re-trowel. We just kind of apply it one time, and we kind of keep going across and leaving our finished surface behind us. If you have dark spots that bother you with a lump underneath, you can actually sort of dig them out and kind of reapply over them. Or you can drag a little extra mud along and sort of let it deposit over the dark spot. If you trowel an area and burnish it a little different, it'll come out a little darker. So you just kind of have to pay attention to what you're doing and you sort of work your way across. And that's how we do it. And you don't stop for lunch or anything when you're doing an area. I suppose you could if you have to, but it always has a tendency, if you stop and start, you'll have like a cold joint line. As long as we keep going back and forth across this edge, we'll keep it fresh, and it'll all work the same for us. Yeah, I have a tendency to not mind too much working with a rock in my hand like this, but if you find this a little cumbersome, and it can be, it'd be kind of nice to position it in a bucket. You can still pick up little bits at a time off the edge of the rock, even when it's just kind of sitting there on its own. You can sort of grab a little bit there. We're on our final plastering piece here, and I'm just kind of carefully pulling the mud over the nose of the step, just like I have all the other surfaces here with just plastering the step the same way. And I'm just sort of rolling it back and forth over and being careful. It's a little hard to plaster the nose of the step, so you just have to be patient and work with small amounts of mud at a time. Just be careful. And if you do it, you can use the cutting knife to do it too. You don't have to use the trowel. I tend to like the trowel because I have more control over it. Okay, now we've let the floor cure up overnight, and that has been an adequate amount of time for this one to be perfectly dry. But you do want to make sure, no matter how long your floor has been drying, that it is dry. If it's wet or moist or cold, it might take longer than just overnight. And this is real dry here, and it's ready for us. And what we're going to do in preparation for our sealers is we're going to lightly sand it. And what I have is 150 grit sandpaper. I prefer to use 150 or finer. I find even 120 sometimes can leave little scratch marks that I don't like too much. And all that I'm going to do is you can kind of run your hand over the surface and you'll feel the sort of the roughness and some of the texture. And if you just sand it even that much and run your hand over the surface, you'll notice that it feels smooth already. And so that's what we're going to do, just that much sand into the entire floor. I generally don't use power sanders because I'm not really trying to sand it smooth. I'm just trying to knock that roughness off. And then after I've done that to the whole floor and cleaned it a little bit, then I come by with a SnapDry, and this is a very fine grit. These are synthetic steel wool, and the maroon color is the one that I prefer because it's the right grit, and it also doesn't have a tendency to lose its color when you and make things red or green that some of the other ones do. And I just lightly SnapDry it because I found that kind of goes into the little dips of the texture a little better than the sandpaper does. And it's the final thing we do before we clean it and apply our sealer. put the sealers on, and we use the little rectangular pads to do it. And I always take, because of the hair on these pads tends to fall out a little bit when you first start, I always take some tape, just kind of check it for any loose hairs so that we don't have to deal with that. And then the type of sealer that we're going to use for this first coat is our sealer, the Cementic Sealer, and it's a urethane. And the reason I like these rectangular pads is because you can do circular motions with it. So I don't like to do linear lines. I like to do circular motions because that matches in with the pattern of our trail marks anyway. We're just going to kind of put a light coat of this on right now. We're going to do a little staining, and this will kind of be our stain control for being able to do that. So we'll just do a light coat, kind of work it in as you go. You're really not leaving any kind of a film excess. It'll still have a real matte look when you're finished. And you will want to put your respirator on for this unless you're in an outside area, because the smell of this is not something that you want to have to deal with. And we do like to try to keep the wet edge going as we do this. So I'll work my way back and forth across the edge. And always in a circular pattern. Okay, the finish that we're doing on this floor has a couple of coats of stain on it, and the stain that we're using is 1/2 water to 1/2 E, the Milestone E acrylic, and then pigments in it, just universal tints. And this is a pretty dark stain. Now we first sealed the floor with urethane so that when we stain an area, and then we stain another area next to it, it does get darker on the overlaps because it's already kind of got a little bit of a penetration control on it. We just kind of go across, we make sure our stain gets down into our texture good. And there's a little bit of an art for it to just sort of work in little areas at a time and not trying to do great big areas, and just sort of blending your edges in good. And you can watch for it to go darker and lighter and just kind of control it a little bit as you put it on. Here we have our stain all evened out on our floor now, so we're going to go on and put our sealers on it. And the first coat of sealer I'm going to use is a Glitza product called SnapDry. And we're just going to flow this. This is a water-based sealer. And we're going to flow it out on it with the same pads we use with our other sealers. And we're just going to kind of work it just enough so that it has a light film over the surface. And no puddles, and try to work with circular motions, and try to keep a wet edge as you go as well. I wanted to show you what the final finish came out like in this project. We're in the Olympic Fairmont, and one of the shops called World Lux. They sell watches and pins and other leather goods. And this was the finish that they had selected for their floor. I just wanted you to see how it came out.